Let us try to understand what are the points we'll be covering in this chapter, what we call as the roadmap. The roadmap of the chapter, we will first take an overview of the cell. हम एक cell का general परिचय लेंगे, which is called as cell introduction. Then we will talk about cell theories and discoveries in the field of cell. Then we will try to study the cell in more detail. Here we will first try to study the cell from outside, where we'll study the size and shape of the cell. And then we will try to study the cell from inside, where we will study the different internal parts of the cell, like the cell membrane, the cell wall, the cell organelles, the nucleus, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum. You've been hearing these terms since the last few years, so we will have a more detailed understanding of each of these parts of the cell, okay, inside or internal parts. And then in between all this, we will have short sessions on two important type of cells present on this earth, prokaryotic cell and eukaryotic cell. Okay, these are the points which will be covered in this chapter. Prokaryotic and eukaryotic cell are covered at different places, so you will hear about them in between, but these are by and large the sections that we will try and cover. So students, let us start with cell, the introduction. As you would agree, this world can be classified or divided into two major categories. One is non-living, and second is what is more important for this chapter, that is living. So students, tell me, what is the difference between living and non-living things? You know all the differences. You all have studied science before. This is a very basic question, so I will not tell you the differences exactly, okay? And we know plants do different things, animals do different things, humans do different things, whereas a furniture, a fan, a car, a mobile, a laptop does different things. So why is this difference? Why is the difference? What is the difference? The difference is that living things are made up of cells. Living things are made up of cells. That is the difference. The cell is present here. Here there is no cell. This is the main difference between living and non-living things. Now, let's go further ahead into cell introduction. The living things in this world are called as living organisms, and all living organisms are made up of cells. Just how any building is made up of bricks, any living organism, maybe a mango, a strawberry, a plant, a monkey, a donkey, an actor, a dog, a peacock, a pigeon, a parrot, any living organism is made up of cells. So cell is the most basic structure. And any function that is done by the body of a living organism is actually done by cells. Okay, so when we are doing any work, the work is actually done by our cells. When plants are preparing their own food, it is actually prepared by the leaf cells. So the basic function is done by the cells. So it's a basic structural and functional unit of life. Hope that point is very clear, because it forms the basic component of living organisms and it does every work that a living organism does. Okay, like right now when you are listening to me, it is actually the cells of your ears which are listening to me. So the function of hearing is done by the cells of your ears. Right now, if you are understanding what I am saying, it is done by the cells of your brain. So actually the cells of your brain are understanding me. So everything is actually done by the cells only. Okay. So depending upon number of cells, living organisms can be divided into two categories. One is those living organisms which are unicellular and those living organisms which are multicellular. Living organisms which are unicellular, as the word suggests, uni meaning one, cellular meaning cell. They are made up of only one cell. Multi meaning many, cellular meaning cell. They are made up of many cells. If we try and understand, this is the classification of living organisms based on the number of cells. Okay, and this is how some cells are just single and some cells are present in groups. Now, if we look at another way, another classification, living organisms are made up of cells, and depending upon the type of cells, living organisms can be either prokaryotes or they can be eukaryotes. Prokaryotes are those living organisms which are made up of प्रोकैरियोटिक सेल्स. जो प्रोकैरियोटिक सेल से बनते हैं उन्हें प्रोकैरियोट्स कहा जाता है. सिमिलरली इफ यू ट्राई टू राइट अ कंपैरेटिव स्टेटमेंट, उसी तरह से अगर हम सोच के लिखने की कोशिश करें, दोज लिविंग ऑर्गेनिजम्स which are made up of eukaryotic cells are called as eukaryotes. Further to that, prokaryotic cells are old cells, primitive cells. Old cells are called as primitive cells, and eukaryotes are more developed cells. Students, you and me are made up of eukaryotic cells. It is interesting. Plants are also made up of eukaryotic cells. Very interesting when I tell you that amoeba, paramecium are also made up of eukaryotic cells. So then you will wonder who's made up of prokaryotic cells. And the answer is all bacteria come in this group. All bacteria are prokaryotic cells. So some of you all have a doubt. Okay, then amoeba is not a bacteria? No, amoeba is not a bacteria. Amoeba is a protozoa. Okay, if you remember your classification of animals that you studied, there is a kingdom Monera, where all bacteria come in. There is a kingdom Protista, okay, where you've got amoeba, paramecium. Okay, these are also called as protozoans, or they are called as group Protista. Okay, so they are made up of eukaryotic cells. So protozoans like amoeba, paramecium, euglena, some algae, plants, actually algae come under plants itself. I've just tried to keep it separate here. And animals are made up of eukaryotic cells. Here you've got bacteria, and some of the unicellular bacteria are also called as algae, like blue-green algae, also called as cyanobacteria. Okay, so this is one example where certain algae come under prokaryotes, but these algae will always be unicellular algae. That is a very important point. Okay, so this is just a general idea about what are prokaryotes and what are eukaryotes. Of course, we will study their structure in detail as we go further ahead. But for now, we've got a general introduction. Now, we finish this section and we now go on to the next section. The next section is about cell discoveries and theories. Cell discoveries and theories. So, who discovered cell? Who are the main pioneer scientists, pioneering work performing scientists in this field? Okay, we have heard about one scientist very often when we studied about cell. This gentleman is Robert Hooke. Okay, so if you are applying for different state exams, you can get these are factual points. There is not much biology concept in this, but you must remember the names so that you are able to address certain multiple choice questions or even certain interview questions. Robert Hooke was the gentleman who discovered cells, but the cells which he saw for the first time were dead cells. Then he had another scientist whose name we hear very often. This great gentleman is Anton von Leeuwenhoek. He was the first one who discovered a live cell. Then the first half of the 18th century, okay, if you are talking about 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that was a time when all the scientists were really after having a lot of research on cells. Everyone wanted to prove, all scientists wanted to prove that we did something on cell, and cell was a very hot topic. Okay, so in the year 1838, started certain cell theories. And the first one came in 1838 when M.J. Schleiden, who was a botanist, meaning a scientist who studied plants, he said all plants are made of cells. all plants are made of cells. And the world looked around and said, oh, really? You may find such a general statement. Today, every small kid says that. But in 1838, it was a big scientific statement. It was a big scientific discovery which M.J. Schlitten had proved after doing multiple experiments on plants and declaring this. Then, in the next year, 1838 was after M.J. Schlitten. 1839 was another gentleman by the name of Theodore Schwann. This gentleman studied animals. He was a zoologist. And he went on to say, all animals were made of cells. And he went on to say that in animals, the outermost covering is cell membrane. And the world again looked back at this man and said, oh, is it? Today we feel it as a very basic statement, but in 1839, he had studied multiple animals to come to this conclusion. Both these gentlemen did a lot of studies on plant and animal cells. But how are new cells formed? How do we get new cells? What happens to the old cells? This was not studied a lot in detail by M.J. Schlitten and Theodore Schwann. We had another scientist who did a lot of work in this field. So we continue the cell theories on the next slide. And then this man came with a cell theory. His name was Virchow. His name was Virchow. The full name was Rudolf Virchow, who in the year 1855 made a statement in Latin. And the name of the statement was Omnis Cellula Cellula. What does this mean? He said any new cell always arises from an old cell. Number one. And number two, how does it arise? The old cell breaks so that the new cell arises. So, in English, it meant all cells arise from pre-existing cells with the help of cell division. Without cell division, no new cells can arise. He also said another statement which he went on to prove, that every multicellular organism starts a life from a single cell. He said every multicellular organism, once upon a time it is a single cell. Like you and me, once upon a time inside our mothers, we were formed as a single cell, which today in reproduction we call as zygote. And then this zygote divides divides and becomes multicellular, and then it becomes tissues, and then it develops into organs, and then it develops into organ systems like digestive system, respiratory system, and the different systems. And that is how our human body is developed. Okay, so that was predicted in 1865 by Rudolf Virchow. And then finally, all this understanding was clubbed by a committee which gave a theory which is called as the modern cell theory. Okay, so you must know what is modern cell theory. Modern cell theory said it's a combination of everything that we've studied till now. Okay, it said that cell is the basic unit of life. The second thing that modern cell theory did is that it said all plants and animals are made of cells. Third thing, it said all new cells arise from existing cells by cell division. And the last point it said is every life, whether unicellular or multicellular, starts as a single cell. So that's the modern cell theory. And with that we come to the end of this section called as cell discoveries, and we now start to study the cell in further detail, first from outside and then later on from inside. Going further ahead in the study of the cell, okay, first we try to study the cell from outside, and then we go into the electron microscopic study of the internal structures. But whenever we studied the plant cell is generally studied with the onion peel. And the animal cell is generally studied the cheek cells. Cheek cells, that is the inner layer, okay, of the cheek, okay, that's the mucosa or the epithelial lining as we call it, is generally studied if you are doing it in humans, okay. And when we try to study it, these are the parts of cell we come across. The first one is cell membrane. The second one, cell wall, present in only plants and bacteria, not present in animal cells. Then we come to cytoplasm, the fluid inside the cell. Then we come to cell organelles. Okay, these are the small structures inside the cell, and they are called as, just how our hands, legs, head, eyes, nose are called as organs of the body. Nucleus, mitochondria, Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum, lysosomes, vacuoles, these terms you've heard before, these are the organs of the cell. Okay, so therefore they get the name cell organelles. Okay, now cell organelles in prokaryotic cell, they do not have their own covering. Not membrane bound. Whereas in eukaryotic cells, every organelle has its own covering. The nucleus has its own covering. Okay, let me show you this picture. Look at this picture. This is the picture of a eukaryotic cell. The mitochondria. Look at the borders. The lysosome. Look at the borders. Everyone has their own covering. This is Golgi. Look at the borders. This is endoplasmic reticulum. Look at the borders. I'll try to show you another picture. Okay, see this. Every organelle is shown to have a covering, whereas here the organelles are less, and every organelle does not have its own covering. So that's eukaryotic and that's prokaryotic. So prokaryotic, no membrane bound organelles, whereas eukaryotic is membrane bound organelle. Students, please remember this. This is one of the basic fundamentals of cellular biology. Okay. Now we go further ahead. Under the cell organelles, we have nucleus. Now, in prokaryotic, there is no proper nucleus. Why? Because nucleus does not have any covering. There is no nuclear membrane. So, no well-defined nucleus. Whereas in a eukaryotic cell, look at this. Okay, here look at the nucleus. No, there's no proper nucleus. Here there is a proper nucleus. Okay, so there is a well-defined nucleus. And the other organelles inside the cell are endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, vacuoles. We continue them here, lysosomes, chloroplasts, or they also call them as plastids, and this one is present only in plant cells. You've got mitochondria. So these are the different cell organelles, and here we've tried to give you some good idea as to how do these organelles